The farmhouse never stood out, not in photographs, not in the memories of those who drove past it on their way to the nearby town, and certainly not in the official county records where buildings are reduced to mere coordinates and construction dates. It was ordinary to the point of invisibility. A slanted red roof, weather-beaten white walls, and a sagging porch that creaked whenever the wind brushed through the valley. To outsiders, it was just another aging structure quietly sinking into the earth. But to the locals, especially those who had lived long enough to remember the old stories, it was something else entirely. The land around the farmhouse always seemed a little too still. Birds avoided the tall oak tree behind the barn. Dogs refused to cross the fence line. And every winter, when the first snow arrived, it melted faster on this property than anywhere else, exposing patches of dark, disturbed soil long before spring had even begun. People joked that the ground here ran warm with secrets, but no one said it with a smile. Most rural legends fade with time, but the whispers around this farmhouse only grew more persistent. Some said they heard digging at night when the world was silent. Others claimed the lights flickered inside the empty building, long after the last known owner had passed away. A few recalled strange visitors, men in heavy coats and gloves, coming to the property at impossible hours and leaving before dawn. No one admitted to investigating. No one wanted to know what pulled those men back again and again. But the most unsettling detail, repeated by generations of locals, was this: the land never stayed still. Whenever the county surveyors came, the soil readings changed. Depth, density, mineral content, nothing remained consistent. It was as if the ground had been turned over, layer after layer, again and again across the span of a century. Yet no crops were grown here, no renovations were made, and no family stayed long enough to cultivate anything at all. There were stories, of course. Rumors of disappearances, unsolved cases, and travelers who took the wrong road and were never seen again. But these stories lived only in hushed tones, never written down, never formally reported. In small towns, silence is its own kind of protection. People learn to let some shadows remain shadows. Still, the farmhouse always seemed to be waiting. Waiting for someone to finally step inside. Waiting for someone to peel back its floorboards. Waiting for the truth to claw its way out of the earth. And on one cold evening, with rain clouds gathering low and sunlight dying behind the hills, the waiting finally ended. A call came in. A frantic voice. A discovery that none of the responding officers were emotionally prepared for. At first, it sounded routine: structural damage, a suspected sinkhole, possibly exposing a forgotten basement beneath the farmhouse. But the dispatcher noted something strange in the caller's tone, a kind of trembling disbelief, as if he couldn't articulate what he had just witnessed. When investigators arrived, they found the porch partially collapsed. Wooden beams had snapped, revealing a hollow space beneath the structure. But this wasn't a simple foundation cavity. The soil had shifted unnaturally, almost deliberately, exposing a narrow opening that breathed out cold, stale air from somewhere far below. Flashlights cut through the darkness, but the ground didn't look like ordinary earth. It looked layered, stratified, as though different timelines had been stacked on top of each other. Pieces of fabric. Chips of painted wood. Something metallic glinting faintly beneath the dirt. None of it made sense. None of it should have been here. One of the investigators knelt. Brushing away the upper layer of soil, he uncovered a rusted tool, hand-forged, old enough to belong in a museum. And beneath it, another artifact. And beneath that, something organic. That was the moment everything changed. The farmhouse was no longer just a rumor. No longer a local legend. It was a crime scene, one that stretched far beyond the lifespan of any living resident. As the lead investigator stepped back, trying to process what he was seeing, only one thought echoed through his mind: whatever happened here, didn't happen once. And with that realization, the story truly begins. The night the investigation began wasn't stormy, dramatic, or marked by anything unusual. It was ordinary, quiet, still, the kind of night where people locked their doors early and let the world fade into darkness. But that's how many tragedies begin, not with lightning, but with silence. At 9:47 p.m., the county dispatch center received a call. The voice on the other end belonged to Evan Rourke, a part-time farm equipment mechanic who had been hired to assess the old farmhouse for potential restoration. His tone was tight, breathless, almost as if speaking required physical effort. He kept repeating the same line, "The floor, it just gave way. And there's something down there." The dispatcher, accustomed to panicked homeowners and late-night accidents, tried to steady him. "Sir, is anyone injured?" she asked. A long pause followed, filled only by the crackling of static. Then Evan whispered, "I don't know if what I'm looking at was ever alive." Minutes later, 2 sheriff's units and a volunteer fire crew were dispatched to the farmhouse. They expected a structural collapse, maybe a broken leg or a trapped worker. What they found instead was far stranger, and far older, than any emergency they had ever responded to. When they arrived, Evan was standing outside the farmhouse, his clothes covered in dust and splinters, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He pointed toward the porch, where warped wooden planks sagged into a narrow opening. The air around it was cold, unnaturally cold, despite the mild spring night. Fire Chief Lawson approached first, shining a flashlight into the gap. "What am I looking at?" he muttered. Beneath the fallen boards wasn't cracked dirt or rock. It was an open cavity, rectangular, almost structured, with walls lined in compacted soil that bore clear tool marks. Someone had carved this hollow space deliberately. Deputy Mel Torres crouched beside the opening. The beam of her flashlight glinted off something metallic partially embedded in the soil, a hinge? A bracket? A piece of rusted iron that had long forgotten its purpose. She pushed away a layer of dirt and exposed the edge of what looked like a wooden frame. "This wasn't a collapse," she said slowly. "This was covered up." But covered up when? And why? The responders widened the opening, using crowbars and gloved hands. As debris cleared, a distinct odor drifted upward, not rot, not decay, but the stale, suffocating scent of a place sealed off from oxygen for decades. Then they found the first object. A child's shoe. Small, leather, cracked with age. The kind that hadn't been manufactured since the early 1900s. Evan felt his knees weaken. "I didn't touch anything," he said urgently. "It was just there." Before the shock could settle, another object appeared beneath the soil, this time unmistakably human. A bone. Compact. Smooth. Too small to belong to an adult. Torres stepped back, her breath catching. "Call the sheriff," she said. "And get the coroner out here. Now." Within an hour, the property was roped off. Floodlights flooded the front yard, casting long shadows across the abandoned house. Investigators gathered in clusters, their whispers blending with the buzzing generators. The peaceful valley was suddenly transformed into a scene of controlled chaos. Sheriff Nathan Caldwell arrived last. Known for his calm presence and stern discipline, he rarely let emotion show. But when he looked into the cavity beneath the porch, his expression tightened. "This is old," he said. "Older than anything we've dealt with." As deputies documented the scene, a geotechnical specialist used a ground-penetrating radar device to map the soil beneath the house. The readings flickered across his monitor, revealing anomalies, multiple voids, layers of disturbed earth, and dense clusters of objects buried deep below. "How many?" Caldwell asked. The specialist hesitated. "At least 6, separate disturbances. Maybe more." He swallowed. "And they span decades." Evan, sitting in the back of an ambulance, heard their voices from afar. The medic attending to him noticed his distant stare. "You're in shock," she said softly. "Just breathe." But how could he explain what he felt? When the floor collapsed beneath him, it wasn't random. The wood had splintered perfectly along a seam, as if whatever was underneath had been pushing upward. As if the farmhouse itself wanted to be exposed after all these years. Meanwhile, investigators recovered more artifacts, buttons, scraps of linen, a rusted buckle, and what looked like a fragment of a wooden toy. Each item carried the weight of a life that had vanished long ago. None belonged to the recorded owners of the farmhouse. None matched missing persons from recent decades. This wasn't a modern crime scene. It was a timeline, layered, concealed, and waiting to be read. But the true shock came when Deputy Torres uncovered a small metal tag, etched faintly with a date, 1913. Nearly 112 years old. This was no isolated incident. No recent tragedy. It was the beginning of something sprawling, a story buried under generations of silence. As the investigators stepped back, absorbing the gravity of what lay beneath them, the sheriff gave the order, secure every inch of this property. No one enters without clearance. This isn't just a collapse, this is a century of crimes waiting to surface. For the first time in decades, the quiet farmhouse was awake. And it was about to tell its story, whether anyone wanted to hear it or not. The following morning, before the sun had even lifted its pale glow over the valley, the farmhouse was already swarming with investigators, forensic teams, and county officials who had no idea what they were about to step into. Overnight, the site had transformed from a forgotten relic into the epicenter of what felt like a century-old nightmare slowly peeling itself open. No one said it out loud, but the unspoken tension in the air, the stiff shoulders, the tight jaws, made one thing clear: this discovery wasn't going to be simple, and it wasn't going to be small. Sheriff Caldwell stood beside the porch, sipping a coffee gone cold, as forensic anthropologist Dr. Mara Ellison crouched near the opening, carefully brushing away the loosened soil. She worked with the quiet precision of someone who had seen too much, yet nothing in her years of experience had prepared her for the strange layering beneath this farmhouse. Soil typically settled in predictable patterns, but this earth looked tampered with, folded and refolded like pages of a book rewritten by multiple authors over time. "It's compacted differently here," she murmured. "Not natural sediment. Someone built this up deliberately, again and again." Caldwell frowned. "Meaning what, exactly?" "Meaning this wasn't one burial," she replied. "This ground was used over decades." Her words hung in the air like a cold breath. The deputies working nearby paused, listening despite themselves. Everyone felt it instinctively: the crime wasn't a single act of horror, but a continuous ritual carried out across generations. As the team expanded the opening, the first artifact to emerge was a small tin pail. Its metal was tarnished, edges curled, yet its shape remained unmistakable. It belonged to a child, or rather, to many children who had grown up in the early 20th century. A moment later, another object surfaced, a chipped ceramic doll head with one hollow eye and a faint smile that felt unnervingly out of place in the shadows of this hidden chamber. Deputy Torres knelt and whispered to herself, "Why toys? Why under a porch?" No one had an answer. Forensic techs began filtering dirt through fine screens, revealing more unsettling fragments: a rusted hairpin, bits of leather, pieces of rope, and what looked like an old, hand-carved whistle. Every item carried stories that had been buried deep enough to keep them silent for over 100 years. Meanwhile, Dr. Ellison extracted a bone fragment from the soil. She held it gently between gloved fingers, studying its structure. "Human," she confirmed quietly. "Subadult. Likely a child." Evan Rourke, who had returned reluctantly to give his official statement, felt his stomach twist. Are we sure these aren't old animal bones? This was farmland." Ellison shook her head. "Animals don't leave growth plates like this." Evan looked away. He hadn't slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that collapsed porch, felt the wood breaking beneath him, heard the earth whispering from below. He kept replaying it in his mind, telling himself it was an accident, but deep down, he sensed something older, colder, and far more intentional was at work. The deeper they dug, the stranger the findings became. Soil samples revealed pockets of ash, layers of charcoal, and fragments of burnt cloth. Something, or someone, had tried to destroy evidence here, but only partially. As if the person responsible wanted to hide their crimes, yet ensure that the future would eventually uncover them. Caldwell rubbed the bridge of his nose, feeling the beginning of a headache. He wasn't a man prone to superstition, but nothing here felt normal. The floorboards collapsing at the exact spot where the first objects lay. The unnatural warmth of the soil despite cold nights. The rapid erosion that exposed artifacts without any human disturbance. It was as if the land itself had decided it was done keeping secrets. Dr. Ellison signaled for the team to widen the excavation area. As they did so, a set of wooden boards emerged, thick planks arranged in a structure resembling a boxed enclosure. The wood was ancient, darkened, brittle, but unmistakably crafted by hand. It wasn't part of the farmhouse foundation. This was something built long before the house existed. A burial box? Torres wondered. No, Ellison said slowly. This is too shallow for that. And see these grooves? These are tool marks. Someone dismantled something here, or hid something. When the boards were removed, a chilling sight greeted them. A tattered piece of cloth, once striped in faded colors, wrapped around a small bundle of bones. The cloth was tied with twine, primitive, frayed, and aged far beyond living memory. Torres swallowed hard. This was a child. Someone took the time to wrap them. The air grew heavier. Even the wind outside seemed to pause. But just when the emotional weight felt unbearable, the investigation took a sharp turn. A cluster of metallic shards surfaced, bent, rusted, fused together by time. At first glance, they resembled nails. But upon closer inspection, Ellison noted something disturbing. These weren't mass-produced, she said. They're hand-forged. And inconsistent. Different makers? Caldwell asked. Or different eras, she replied. Some are early 1900s. Others, closer to the 1950s. Decades apart. Same location. Same burial patterns. Torres looked around the farmhouse with new, unsettling awareness. So someone kept coming back here. Not someone, Ellison corrected. Multiple someones. Or a single family passing down, something. A chilling realization settled over the group. This wasn't a one-time incident. Not even a spree. This was a legacy, a ritual carried out by generations tied to this land. Then came the moment that sealed the gravity of the case. As a technician brushed aside another layer of compacted soil, he froze. His flashlight caught something pale and round, like a stone. But when he cleared the dirt completely, the object stared back with a hollow, empty socket. A skull. Tiny. Fragile. Placed with deliberate care. And beneath it, another. And another. Not scattered, not chaotic. Arranged. Torres stepped back, her voice barely audible. This was organized. Categorized. Like someone documented their work. Caldwell exhaled slowly, the horror settling deep in his bones. This isn't the first layer, he said. This is just the beginning. The farmhouse, silent for a century, was finally telling its story, and the first chapter was already more horrifying than anyone imagined. Long before investigators ever stepped onto the property, long before the farmhouse became a whispered warning among locals, there was a family whose name had all but vanished from public memory. They were the first to claim this land, long before roads were paved, before the county was even officially established. And yet, despite their early presence, very little written record of them survived. What did remain was scattered, contradictory, and eerily incomplete. The family was known as the Hollands, a surname once familiar in the valley but now spoken only by the oldest residents, and even then, only with a certain cautious reluctance. According to land grants dated around 1904, the patriarch, Jonathan Holland, purchased the acreage with the intention of building a prosperous farm and raising a large family. The earliest photographs showed him as a stern-faced man with narrow eyes and a rigid posture, a man who seemed more carved from stone than born of flesh. His wife, Eleanor, appeared softer, almost fragile, her gaze drifting somewhere unsettlingly distant in every surviving image. They had 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter, though census records never agreed on the exact ages or birth years. The Hollands arrived during a difficult era. Economic downturns, disease, and poor soil conditions plagued the region. Many new settlers left within a year. But the Hollands stayed. They built the farmhouse themselves, hauling timber from nearby woods, laying each board without assistance. Neighbors later recalled how quickly the house went up, too quickly, some said. As if the family was desperate to move inside, to be shielded from something, or to hide something within its walls. But the strange behaviors didn't stop with the construction. From the moment the Hollands settled, things around the valley began to change. Livestock from neighboring properties went missing. Tools vanished. Smoke rose from the Holland property at odd hours, sometimes late into the night, even when no one appeared to be working. And the children, they were rarely seen. When they did appear in town, they clung tightly to each other, speaking only in whispers and flinching at sudden sounds. Their clothes were always slightly misbuttoned, their hair unevenly cut, their faces pale as if they hadn't seen proper sunlight in weeks. Some neighbors tried to report their concerns, but nothing ever came of it. Back then, the county did not have the structure it has now. Law enforcement was minimal, and most disputes were settled through handshakes or grudges. The Hollands, despite their quiet nature, seemed to invoke an instinctive sense of unease in everyone who crossed their path. People learned quickly to mind their own business. Yet, the contradictions began almost immediately. According to county meeting minutes, Jonathan was described as a level-headed, reliable man. But diaries from several women in town painted him as unpredictable, often seen muttering to himself or staring across open fields for hours at a time. Store records indicated he bought large quantities of rope, nails, kerosene, and lime, far beyond what a family farm required. But when questioned, he shrugged it off, saying he was preparing the ground. No one asked for what. One detail stood out across nearly every account: the Hollands never hired help. They never allowed visitors. And they never let anyone inside the farmhouse. Deliveries were left at the fence line. Repairs were done by Jonathan alone, even when laborers offered assistance for free. The family moved through the community like shadows, present, but never fully seen. There was one exception. In 1912, a traveling minister documented a visit to the farmhouse after Eleanor requested a blessing. He wrote that the interior felt like a place dipped in sorrow, the walls too thick, the air too stale, the rooms too dim despite the windows. He noted scratches on the floorboards, odd stains near the cellar door, and a smell he described as the scent of damp earth unturned for too long. Most chillingly, he mentioned hearing what sounded like soft tapping from beneath the house as he prayed. When he asked about it, Eleanor froze, her eyes welling with tears she refused to let fall. Jonathan dismissed it as pipe settling, though the farmhouse had no plumbing at the time. 2 weeks later, Eleanor stopped appearing in town altogether. The eldest son, Caleb, took on her errands with a hollow, resigned expression. He avoided eye contact, rarely spoke, and always kept his hands hidden in his sleeves. People commented that his posture changed, shoulders hunched as if carrying something far heavier than a sack of grain. His younger siblings, Samuel and Rose, were seen less and less until they vanished entirely from public view. When townsfolk asked about them, Jonathan offered vague explanations: illness, visiting relatives, chores. No one believed him, but again, no one pressed further. What records did survive from that period show a disturbing pattern. The county experienced a spike in missing persons between 1910 and 1920. Vagrants, travelers, a salesman, a teacher who lived alone. All vanished within a mile radius of the Holland property. But because record-keeping was inconsistent and communication between towns was poor, the disappearances were never connected. Still, rumors spread. A farmhand from a neighboring property swore he saw Jonathan digging late at night, illuminated only by a lantern and the dim glow of embers. Another claimed to hear singing, soft, mournful, echoing across the valley long after midnight. And one frightened child reported seeing someone, or something, crawling on all fours near the edge of the Holland field. The final documented appearance of any Holland family member came in 1921, when Jonathan himself arrived in town for supplies. Witnesses described him as thinner, paler, and possessed of a trembling in his hands he couldn't conceal. He left abruptly, leaving behind half his purchased goods. After that, no one ever saw him, or any of his children, again. The farmhouse stood silent for months. Then years. Then decades. Ownership records grew murky. Sometimes the property was listed as abandoned, other times as, under estate review. But nothing was ever sold. No heirs came forward. And no official explanation surfaced for why the Hollands had simply disappeared from the face of the earth. But the contradictions persisted. Town folklore claimed a burial mound existed behind the house. An archived letter from a former sheriff mentioned being told to leave the Hollands alone. A lost newspaper clipping referenced disturbances after their disappearance but offered no details. And now, as investigators uncovered layers of soil beneath the farmhouse, soil disturbed repeatedly across decades, the past was resurfacing with undeniable clarity. Someone lied. Someone concealed. And someone, whether from the Holland family or connected to them, left behind a legacy so sinister that it remained hidden for over a century. Whatever happened on this land didn't end when the Hollands vanished. It merely went underground. For decades, the Holland farmhouse existed like an unsettling shadow at the edge of town, visible enough to be acknowledged, yet avoided with such consistency that it became part of the valley's unspoken rules. But alongside the silence, there were witnesses. People who saw fragments of the truth, who sensed something terribly wrong stirring beneath the soil. Their warnings, however, whether due to fear, prejudice, or simple disbelief, were dismissed, buried, or quietly forgotten. And now, as investigators uncovered layers of horror beneath the farmhouse, these ignored voices began resurfacing like ghosts demanding to be heard. One of the earliest known accounts came from Peter Higgins, a farmhand who worked on a neighboring property in 1915. His statement never made it into any official ledger, but his granddaughter shared it in a handwritten journal decades later. According to Peter, he often heard muffled screams carried by the wind, sounds that rose in the dead of night and dissolved before dawn. At first, he assumed he was imagining things. The valley was known for its echoing hills and trick-of-the-ear acoustics. But the more he heard them, the less they felt like tricks. He described one night in particular, when the screams seemed to rise directly from the earth itself, vibrating the ground beneath his boots. He told his employer. The employer told the sheriff. The sheriff told him to stop drinking. After that, Peter kept his silence. Another account surfaced from Mary Whitford, who as a child used to pick berries along the fence line bordering the Holland property. In her recollection, she once saw a small hand reaching through the slats of the wooden fence, thin, shaking, dirt-caked. She thought at first it was one of the Holland children, though the hand looked almost too frail. When she froze in fear, the hand disappeared. Moments later, Jonathan Holland appeared from behind the barn, giving her a glare so sharp she ran home without her basket. When she told her mother, she was instructed never to return to that boundary again. Mary grew up believing she had been mistaken. But now, investigators wondered if she had stumbled upon something far more horrifying than a frightened child. Then there was Samuel Brewer, a delivery man who hauled goods between rural towns in the 1920s. His surviving letters mentioned the Holland family only briefly, but what he did write was unsettling. He recalled approaching the farmhouse one early morning to drop off flour and animal feed. The sun hadn't risen yet, but he noticed lanterns glowing inside the barn. When he stepped closer, he heard the faint, rhythmic thud of metal striking dirt, digging. Not the kind done with shovels, but with something sharper, heavier, almost desperate. He called out a greeting, but the digging stopped abruptly. Silence pressed so heavily on him that he backed away, leaving the supplies near the fence without waiting for payment. Brewer reported the incident to the deputy marshal at the time. But the marshal dismissed the concern, stating plainly, "The Hollands tend to their own business. Best you do the same." But perhaps the most disturbing witness account came from children, those who didn't yet know how to protect adults from uncomfortable truths. Throughout the 1930s, local teachers recorded several instances of children drawing strange images in their school sketches. Figures underground. Stick figure people holding lanterns. A house with black arrows pointed down beneath its foundation. One child even drew a tunnel system with crude lines representing people inside, some standing, others lying down. When a teacher asked what the drawing meant, the boy replied, "Mama says not to talk about the people under the Holland house." The teacher, uneasy, asked the parents. They insisted their son was imagining things. No further action was taken. As decades passed, more stories emerged, each stranger than the last. Several hunters swore they heard metal chains rattling near the property long after the Holland family vanished. A traveling salesman claimed he saw a lantern flicker in the attic window, even though the house had no electricity at the time. A group of teenagers exploring the area once found a patch of freshly disturbed soil near the barn, warm to the touch, steaming in the cold air, though no one had worked that land in years. Every witness described something different, yet all their stories contained one repeated detail: the digging. Always at night. Always rhythmic. Always coming from somewhere deep beneath the house. When investigators interviewed the town's oldest living resident, Mr. Alric Jennings, aged 96, he recounted a memory so vivid it made the room fall silent. He was 10 years old when the Hollands disappeared. He remembered the night townspeople gathered at the church, whispering, fearful, unsure what to make of the family's sudden vanishing. That same night, he and two friends snuck toward the property, fueled by childish curiosity. As they approached the farmhouse, they felt vibrations in the ground, small tremors, like a heartbeat pulsing beneath the soil. Then they heard it. A voice, faint and echoing, calling out from under the house. He insisted it wasn't the voice of a child, but something older, deeper, strained by pain or exhaustion. His friends ran. He stayed frozen until the voice faded into a prolonged, hollow moan. When he told his parents, they punished him for lying. "Don't speak of that house," his father ordered. "Wise men don't disturb the sleeping dead." Sleeping dead, Jennings emphasized how casually his father had used that phrase, as though it were common knowledge. But no witness had as much insight, or regret, as former Deputy Harold Vance, interviewed shortly before his death in 1983. Vance confessed he had responded to a disturbance call near the Holland property in 1947. A group of migrant workers had reported hearing what they described as suffocation screams, coming from the ground. Vance arrived, surveyed the area, and even noticed an oddly shaped mound of earth near the barn. But when he reported it to his superior, he was told bluntly, "Leave that farm alone, Harold. Let the dead keep their place." Vance admitted that he followed the order, but it haunted him for the rest of his life. He believed someone had been alive, trapped, beneath the ground that night. "I should have dug," he said in the interview recording. "I should have ignored the sheriff. Maybe I could have saved someone, or stopped what came after." Each ignored witness strengthened a chilling pattern: the truth wasn't hidden, it was seen, heard, and felt by many. But every warning was brushed aside, ridiculed, or silenced by those in power. And now, as modern investigators traced the origins of the buried remains, they noticed something deeply disturbing about those old reports. The screams, the digging, the shadows, the soil disturbances, the timeline of these events didn't end with the disappearance of the Holland family. In fact, they continued for decades afterward. Someone else had been on that land. Someone who knew its secrets. Someone who kept the cycle alive long after the Hollands were gone. And with that realization, the investigators began to understand, they weren't just uncovering isolated crimes. They were unveiling a pattern of horror passed down like a grim inheritance, ignored by witnesses, protected by silence, and now finally forced into the light. Long before investigators touched the soil beneath the farmhouse, the valley had been carrying a quiet burden, one written not in documents, but in absences. Names spoken once and then never again. Posters tacked to wooden poles that slowly faded in rain. Letters that reached mailboxes long after their intended recipients had vanished. Each disappearance seemed isolated when examined individually. But now, as the team began piecing together a broader timeline, a horrifying picture emerged. The land around the Holland farmhouse had swallowed lives for more than 100 years. The earliest known disappearance linked, though never officially, to the property was a young boy named Thomas Avery, who vanished in 1909. He had been sent to deliver eggs to a neighbor but never arrived. His bicycle was found leaning against a tree near the Holland fence line. Locals searched for days, combing the woods, checking wells, even draining a pond. But no trace of Thomas was ever found. The sheriff at the time chalked it up to a runaway incident, though no evidence supported the claim. His mother insisted she heard crying near the Holland property days after he vanished. Her testimony, like so many others, was dismissed. Then came Annalise Carter, a traveling seamstress who offered repairs and embroidery services door to door. Records showed she visited nearly every home in the valley, except the Hollands. She had supposedly been headed toward their property when she disappeared in 1914. Her sewing kit was later retrieved from a ditch not far from the farmhouse. Some said the fabric scraps inside bore dirt stains, as if they had been pressed into the soil. The sheriff called it coincidence. Annalise became another unsolved case. By the 1920s and 30s, patterns began to form, even if no one acknowledged them at the time. Travelers, farmhands, migrant workers, and drifters all vanished along the same stretch of rural road. None had established roots in the area. None had people with enough influence to demand deeper investigations. Many of these missing individuals were poor, unconnected, or passing through, a demographic tragically easy to overlook. Investigators found a faded ledger kept by a church volunteer group who provided water and food to traveling laborers. Several names had been crossed out with a crude X. A note beside one entry read, "Last seen heading toward the Holland place after dark." Another entry read, "Did not return for morning roll." Still, no law enforcement officer ever followed up. But the disappearances didn't stop with transients. In 1942, a teacher named Jonathan Hale left his schoolhouse one evening after staying late to grade papers. He often walked home along a path that skirted the edge of the Holland property. Witnesses reported hearing a shout that night, one sharp, abrupt cry that echoed across the valley. When Hale failed to appear the next morning, a search party formed. They found his satchel in the grass, papers scattered by the wind. Some were torn, others soaked in what looked eerily like damp, darkened soil. His trail ended abruptly near the farmhouse's boundary. Despite the evidence, officials labeled him a victim of wild animal activity, though no tracks were found. Hale's disappearance deeply affected the community. He had been loved, respected. But even then, no one dared point directly toward the Hollands. Fear had become a silent governor of truth. As the decades progressed, the missing person cases grew more sporadic but more disturbing. In 1957, two teenage girls, best friends named Margaret and Lila, vanished while collecting wildflowers. Their baskets were found overturned, the stems of freshly picked blossoms crushed into the dirt. Nearby, investigators noted faint impressions in the soil, circular patterns consistent with lantern bases. The report described the soil as loose as if recently disturbed, yet no digging tools or footprints were found. The sheriff insisted the girls must have run away to the city. Their parents never believed that explanation. Then, in the 1960s, came the story of Benjamin "Benny" Ortiz, a migrant worker whose team set up camp near the valley. Benny was known for his joyful personality. One night he wandered off to collect firewood. Witnesses heard a distant metallic clank, followed by a muffled cry. Benny never returned. His friends searched for hours, eventually discovering a shallow, strange indentation in the ground, circular, almost like the beginning of a hole. The soil there was warm, one man noted, like fresh ashes covered it. Warm. Just like the soil investigators found beneath the farmhouse. Just like the ground described in multiple witness testimonies spanning almost a century. What chilled investigators most was how perfectly the rhythm of disappearances aligned with the Holland family timeline. When the Hollands lived on the property, the cases occurred regularly, every 2 or 3 years. After their disappearance in 1921, the pattern didn't stop, it merely shifted. Fewer cases, spaced further apart, but unmistakably connected by geography. It was almost as if someone had inherited not just the land, but the crimes tied to it. During the 1970s, the farmhouse changed hands twice, once to a distant cousin of the Hollands, whose ownership records were vague, and once to an unknown buyer whose identity remained sealed behind legal privacy. Both owners lived there only briefly. Both left abruptly. And during those exact same years, at least 4 individuals vanished within a 5-mile radius. In 1974, a young hitchhiker named Darla Keene disappeared near the main road. Her last known location. A ride from a man in an old pickup truck matching the description of the vehicle owned by the farmhouse's transient caretaker at the time. Nothing ever came of the lead. In 1981, a father and small child camping near the woods reported hearing whispers, actual voices, coming from beneath the earth. When the child wandered too close to the farmhouse perimeter, she burst into tears, screaming that someone underground was calling her name. She was only 5 years old. Adults dismissed it as imagination. But investigators now questioned whether children had always been more attuned to the horrors hidden below. Perhaps the most damning case was that of Clifford Warren, a war veteran who suffered from insomnia. One night in 1994, unable to sleep, he took a walk near the valley. According to neighbors, he mentioned hearing chanting, or low voices, in the distance, sounds that seemed to rise from the soil itself. Warren disappeared that same week. The sheriff attributed it to a mental health crisis. His family insisted he'd been improving, and that he never wandered far. As modern investigators laid all these cases side by side, one truth became undeniable: people had been disappearing near the Holland farmhouse for over 100 years, spanning multiple lifetimes, cultural shifts, technological advancements, and generations of silence. The chilling part wasn't just the volume of disappearances, it was the consistency. Same stretch of land. Same patterns. Same unsettling presence beneath the soil. And now, the forensic analysts began processing the remains found under the farmhouse. The bone fragments, the teeth, the clothing, everything told a timeline that stretched across decades. Some remains were from the early 1900s. Others from the 40s or 50s. Some disturbingly recent, within the last 20 years. The final blow came when a soil strata expert submitted his findings. The disturbances, he said carefully, almost trembling, span multiple generations. Someone kept using the same burial method, the same technique, decade after decade. Someone? Sheriff Caldwell asked quietly. The expert nodded. Or several someones. But all connected to this property. Torres exhaled sharply, the realization settling deep within her chest. This wasn't just a crime scene, she said. This was a hunting ground. A century of missing persons had finally found a common grave, and investigators were only beginning to understand the depth of the darkness buried beneath the quiet farmhouse. By the third day of excavation, the investigators realized they were not dealing with a simple burial pit, nor a single hidden chamber. What lay beneath the farmhouse was far more elaborate, far more intentional. It was a network, a system, a labyrinth carved by hands determined to keep their secrets sealed in darkness. And yet, century after century, those very secrets continued to seep upward, refusing to be forgotten. The ground-penetrating radar had shown irregular shapes, voids too clean to be natural formations. But technology could not prepare the team for what they uncovered when they broke through the first true barrier, a wall made of compacted clay reinforced with wooden beams. It was old, older than the farmhouse above it. When they cleared the final layer of soil, the opening revealed a steep, narrow passage heading downward into cold, unmoving air. Torres stood at the edge, her flashlight trembling slightly in her grip. "This wasn't built by accident," she whispered. "Someone planned this." Sheriff Caldwell nodded grimly. "We go slow. No assumptions. Document everything." The first investigator lowered into the passage found footing on a packed earth floor. The air was stale, heavy, thick with the kind of humidity that forms when a place has been sealed for generations. Lights flickered as they were lowered into the space, illuminating a cramped chamber barely 6 feet wide. It was reinforced with timber ribs, the wood blackened with age, some beams softened by rot but still holding their structure. On the walls were faint grooves, parallel lines carved by tools that no longer existed above ground. "This is early," Dr. Ellison said as she descended carefully behind the team. "Turn-of-the-century construction, maybe older." The chamber itself wasn't the most disturbing part. It was what lay inside. A small wooden table. A rusted lantern. A stack of crude tools, chisels, shovels, hand-forged nails. And on the far wall, etched into the clay, were markings, symbols, tally lines, and what looked like initials. Some overlapped. Others stood alone. They represented a timeline, carved by different hands, different eras. Someone had used this room regularly. Someone had returned to it, again and again. But the first chamber was only the beginning. A second opening branched off from the corner, a narrow tunnel barely high enough for a person to crawl through. Its walls bore the unmistakable smoothness of repeated touch, hands dragging along its surface over decades. Not one investigator wanted to enter first, yet all of them knew the tunnel had to be explored. The crawlspace opened into a larger chamber. This one was unsettling in its meticulousness. The walls had been shaped into perfect rectangles, the floor flattened with care. Along one side lay a row of small wooden crates, each sealed with nails that had nearly fused into the wood over time. When the first crate was gently pried open, the team recoiled. Inside lay a collection of objects that should never have been kept, let alone preserved: a lock of hair tied with string, a button from a child's coat, a cracked toy horse, a ribbon, and what looked like a tooth, small, human. Every crate told a story, each one darker than the last. Torres murmured, her voice tight with dread, "This is a trophy room." Caldwell didn't respond. He couldn't. The chamber continued deeper, revealing more of the labyrinth. Some rooms were crude, unfinished, as if abandoned mid-construction. Others were disturbingly meticulous, rectangular cells carved out with precision. One contained a rusted chain anchored into the clay wall. Another held the remains of a stool, its legs splintered, its top stained with a dark residue that even time could not erase. Dr. Ellison knelt beside the stool, her gloved fingers tracing the ground. "Someone used this place for holding," she said quietly. "Restraints, waiting, maybe interrogation." She looked up, her expression hollow. This wasn't a single killer. This was a process. Then came the most chilling discovery so far. At the back of one chamber was a door. An actual door, handmade, its surface scarred with deep gouges. It had been sealed shut with nails driven in from the outside. Whoever, or whatever, was behind it had never been meant to leave. The team hesitated. Even Caldwell felt a strange heaviness settle in his chest, an instinctual warning that opening this door would change everything. But the truth could not be left behind the wall. Torres pried the nails loose one by one. The hinges groaned as the door cracked open, releasing a rush of cold, suffocating air. Flashlights swept across the interior, and froze. This chamber was different. Circular, symmetrical, and too well crafted. Its walls bore markings, circles, intersecting lines, spiral shapes that seemed to pulse in the flashlight beams. In the center lay a wooden box, small and square, sealed with twine so old it crumbled at the touch. When Ellison cut the twine and lifted the lid, the box revealed something no one expected. A locket. Silver. Tarnished. Etched with initials. R. H. At first, it seemed like another relic. But then Ellison gasped. These initials, they match Rose Holland. Caldwell stiffened. Rose? The daughter? Yes, Ellison whispered. She vanished at age 12. Records say she disappeared with the rest of the family. Torres frowned. But this chamber, it looks newer. Much newer than the early structures. And that was when Ellison pointed to the ceiling of the chamber, where soot stains clung to the clay. This chamber was used decades after the Hollands disappeared. The silence that followed was suffocating. Someone had preserved Rose Holland's locket. Someone who came long after the family vanished. Someone who continued, whatever happened here. The investigators pressed deeper into the chamber and found yet another connecting tunnel, this one reinforced with timber not from the early 1900s, but from the 1940s or 50s. The wood grain, the saw marks, the construction method, everything indicated newer hands. As if generations had passed through these tunnels, expanding them, altering them, adding their own contributions to a legacy of horror. Then they found it. A final room, larger than all the rest. Oval-shaped. Walls smoothed meticulously. The floor covered with stones that seemed arranged with deliberate care. And on one wall, faint but unmistakable, was a handprint pressed into the clay. Not old. Not ancient. Recent. No more than 20 years old. Torres' voice cracked. Someone was down here, not long ago. Caldwell stepped back, trembling. This isn't just a family secret. This isn't just the Hollands. He exhaled slowly, the truth settling like ice in his lungs. This is a system. A tradition. A continuation. The tunnels beneath the farmhouse were not simply relics of an old crime. They were the infrastructure of something far darker, built over generations, expanded by successors, maintained by unseen hands that worked in silence beneath the valley. And the presence of a recent handprint meant only one thing: the creator of the newest chamber might still be alive. The deeper investigators ventured into the underground labyrinth, the clearer it became that the horrors beneath the farmhouse weren't just history, they were lineage. Passed down, guarded, perfected. But buried within the town's forgotten archives and whispered memories, there was one person who had lived long enough, quietly enough, painfully enough, to remember when the final chapter of the Holland family story was never written. Someone who had survived in the shadows for nearly a lifetime without ever telling the truth. Until now. Her name was Agnes Lowell, though she had been known by 3 different surnames over the years. She lived in a tiny house at the edge of the valley, hidden behind an overgrown gate and a porch that sagged just as the farmhouse once had. Investigators first discovered her through census mismatches, records listing her as a child who should have moved away decades earlier, yet she never appeared in any departure logs. When a deputy visited her home, she hesitated to open the door, peering through the crack with cloudy eyes that held a deep, exhausted fear. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice thin but steady. We need to ask about the Holland family, Torres said softly. Agnes froze. Her shoulders tensed, her breath caught. For a moment, she looked as though her heart had stopped completely. No, she whispered. After all these years, no. But something about Torres' expression, gentle, desperate, pleading, made the old woman tremble. She stepped aside and let them in. Her living room was filled with relics from another era, faded photographs, chipped teacups, lace curtains stained with sun damage. Everything felt untouched, like a place trapped in time. She walked slowly, using a cane whose handle had worn smooth from decades of clenching. I knew you'd come one day, she said, lowering herself into an old armchair. I prayed you wouldn't. But I knew. Torres sat across from her. How did you know we'd come? Agnes exhaled shakily. Because evil doesn't stay buried forever. Not down there. Not under that house. Her gaze drifted to the window, as if she could see the farmhouse, even from miles away. Agnes was a child in the late 1930s when her family rented a small property adjacent to the Holland land. Her mother did laundry for townsfolk, her father repaired fences and plows. They were poor, but they were content, until the day her father was approached by a distant relative of the Hollands who claimed to be managing the estate after the family disappeared. The man never gave his name. She described him as tall, with cold, expressionless eyes and a voice that never rose above a whisper. He offered my father work, Agnes said. Said he needed help fixing parts of the property. But Papa refused. He said no money was worth stepping foot on that cursed land. 2 nights later, her father disappeared. No signs of struggle. No footprints. No note. Just absence. I heard him, Agnes said, pressing her trembling hands together. The night he went missing. I heard him yelling for help. But the sound wasn't coming from the fields. It was coming from below. She closed her eyes as if trying to bury the memory again. When I told Mama, she slapped me. Not out of anger, out of terror. She said if I ever repeated that, they would come for me too. The investigators leaned in as she relived the moment with painful clarity. It didn't stop there, Agnes continued. Children, local children, we used to dare each other to go near the Holland fence. One day, I saw something under the porch. A shape. A silhouette. A hand reaching out. But it didn't look right. It didn't move right. She swallowed hard, shaking. I told the sheriff at the time. He told me not to make trouble. He said the Holland place was off limits, that we didn't ask questions about that family. Torres exchanged a look with Caldwell. This matched the pattern perfectly, silence encouraged, warnings dismissed. Why didn't you leave the valley? Caldwell asked gently. Agnes laughed bitterly. We never had the money to leave. And when Mama died, I stayed because I thought if I ran, it would follow me. She leaned forward. That land remembers every tear, every scream, every drop of blood spilled into it. The ground is hungry. Always has been. Torres hesitated. Agnes, did you ever see the Holland children? After the family disappeared? Agnes stared into the distance, eyes welling. Yes. Or I think I did. She took a shaky breath. One night, years after the Hollands were gone, I saw a young girl standing near the barn. Faded dress. Hair messy. Barefoot. She looked lost. But when I walked toward her, she stepped backward into the ground. Torres felt her skin crawl. Into the ground? Agnes nodded slowly. As if there was a door at her feet. A door only she could see. And then she was gone. No one spoke. Even Caldwell, who had seen more horror in his career than he ever admitted, felt the weight of her story pressing down like a stone. Agnes wiped her eyes with the corner of her sleeve. I've kept this inside for too long. But I know what those tunnels are. They weren't just hiding places. They were homes. Homes for people who grew up in the dark. People who didn't know the sun. People who learned to live in silence because silence was survival. A chill ran through Torres' spine. Agnes, she asked quietly, are you saying someone lived down there after the Hollands vanished? Agnes nodded. Not someone. Her voice cracked. Someone's. Plural. The room fell silent. Only the sound of rain tapping against the window broke the tension. They were taught to stay hidden, Agnes whispered. Taught to carry on whatever the Hollands started. I don't know who taught them, but I know what they believed. Torres leaned in. What did they believe? Agnes' eyes filled with a terror so raw it felt contagious. They believed the ground needed feeding. They believed the earth beneath that house was alive. And they believed it was their duty to continue the cycle. Her words lingered in the air like smoke. As investigators left her home, both Torres and Caldwell felt the shift. This wasn't just about uncovering old crimes. This wasn't just about a murderous family. This was about survivors, descendants of darkness, still out there, raised in shadows, bound to rituals no one understood. And Agnes' last words followed them out the door like a warning carved in bone, you haven't found everything. Not yet. There are those still living who know those tunnels better than their own homes. And they're not finished. The investigators left Agnes Lowell's house with the weight of an entire century pulling at their shoulders. Her trembling words replayed in their minds with every step, not someone. Someone's. It wasn't just the Hollands anymore. It wasn't even just their descendants. The crimes beneath the farmhouse had a structure, a rhythm, a purpose, and someone had orchestrated that purpose long after the original family dissolved into dust. The question was no longer who started it. It had become, who kept it alive. Caldwell and Torres spent the next 48 hours digging through county archives, private letters, tax records, inheritance claims, and old arrest logs. Many documents were damaged, incomplete, or purposely redacted by unknown hands decades earlier. But what remained began forming a chilling mosaic. After the Holland family vanished, their land didn't remain abandoned. At least not entirely. The property passed through a strange chain of ownership, names that appeared suddenly, stayed briefly, then disappeared without any trace. One owner in particular stood out. Richard Hale. The younger brother of Jonathan Hale, the teacher who had gone missing in 1942. It was a connection no one had ever noticed. Richard inherited his brother's estate, then purchased the Holland property the following year. He was described in local writings as reclusive, brooding, intelligent but withdrawn. A man haunted by tragedy, according to one neighbor. But his behaviors mirrored unsettling patterns that locals had once associated with the Hollands themselves, strange lights at night, digging behind the barn, tools left out beside freshly disturbed soil. Richard stayed on the land for nearly 20 years. When he finally left, he did so abruptly, without selling the property, without transferring ownership. He simply vanished, leaving behind unpaid taxes and a house that fell slowly into decay. What he didn't leave behind were answers. Torres dug deeper into Richard's life and found something no one expected, a journal kept by one of his neighbors, a woman named Odette Marrow, whose writings were tucked away in a library's restricted history section. In the entries, Odette described Richard speaking to her in fragmented whispers about finishing what they began. She assumed he meant repairing the house or restoring the land. But one entry stood out, he said the children underground were hungry. I laughed at first. He did not. Another entry, Richard told me he was chosen because he understood loss. Only those who have lost can feed the earth properly. Torres closed the journal abruptly, nausea rising. Children underground, she muttered. Was he talking about the ones buried? Or the ones living down there? Caldwell didn't answer. He was staring at a faded photograph they uncovered of Richard Hale standing beside a young girl, thin, pale, barefoot, near the edge of the Holland property. The girl wasn't named. Her existence wasn't even documented beyond that single photograph. But her expression was unmistakable, hollow, resigned, and somehow familiar. "It can't be Rose Holland," Torres whispered. "Rose would have been, no," Caldwell said quietly. "But it could be someone raised by whoever stayed down there. A possible survivor. Or an inheritor." The photo was dated 1956, decades after the Hollands disappeared. The deeper investigators went, the more the timeline mutated. It no longer unfolded in a neat sequence. Instead, it resembled something alive, twisting through generations, carried by different hands, different minds, all bound to one central belief: the ground beneath the farmhouse demanded sacrifice. But then came the revelation that shifted the entire investigation. During a secondary excavation of one of the deeper chambers, forensic teams uncovered a locked metal box, protected by layers of compacted soil. When they pried it open, they found letters, dozens of them, addressed to various unnamed recipients. Some were written in careful script, others in jagged, frantic handwriting. But the oddest part was that many letters were addressed not to a person, but to a role, to the next keeper, to the one who continues, to the heir of the soil. The letters spanned from the 1920s to as late as 1998. Torres read aloud from one dated 1954, "The rituals are simple, but the faith must be strong. The land remembers those who feed it and those who neglect it. Do not falter. Do not fear. The ones below are restless when hungry." Another letter from 1971, "We are not murderers. We are preservers of balance. The valley thrives when the earth is fed." The old family understood this. "You must too." Caldwell clenched his jaw. "This isn't just a tradition. It's indoctrination." It became clear that the crimes committed beneath the farmhouse weren't random acts of madness. They were deliberate. Systematic. Passed from one keeper to the next through handwritten instructions, rituals, and a twisted justification cloaked in folklore. But who wrote the letters? At first, investigators assumed Richard Hale was responsible, but the handwriting varied. Some letters matched his style. Others appeared older. Others still were shockingly modern. A few signatures were present but scribbled out violently, as if the writers feared being identified even among their own. One surviving signature, however, hadn't been erased: E. Holland. Torres's breath hitched. Eleanor? The mother? No, Caldwell whispered, tracing the flourished loop of the initial. Look carefully. This writing, it's too recent. Too steady for a woman from the early 1900s. Realization dawned slowly, chillingly. This wasn't Eleanor Holland. It was someone else. Someone who carried the name forward. Someone who believed they were the rightful heir. A descendant. A survivor. A self-appointed keeper of the soil. The letters also referenced another figure repeatedly, someone described as the original architect, the true voice of the earth, the one who understood the hunger. At first, investigators assumed this referred to Jonathan Holland, the patriarch. But a deeper reading suggested otherwise. The earliest letters called him the first. Later letters called him the mastermind. But what shocked everyone was a line found in a 1933 letter: "He taught us the rituals, but he was not the first to discover them. The land chose him. Just as it chooses each keeper." Torres read the sentence twice, then shut the box. So. Jonathan wasn't the mastermind, she whispered. He was recruited. Caldwell nodded slowly. Or corrupted. And then Torres asked the question no one wanted to answer. If Jonathan wasn't the first, then who was? The investigators stared at one another in suffocating silence. Because suddenly, the scope of this horror expanded far beyond the Holland family, far beyond Richard Hale, far beyond the 20th century. The crimes beneath the farmhouse weren't a family secret. They were a tradition older than the farmhouse itself. A ritual adopted, adapted, and perfected by whoever lived on the land. The mastermind wasn't a single person. It was a lineage. A belief system. A parasite that attached itself to anyone willing, or desperate, enough to listen. And the final letter uncovered held the most devastating revelation yet. The work continues even now. When you read this, know that I am already preparing the next chamber. The ground is ready. The voices are louder than ever. It was dated 2003. The keeper hadn't disappeared. The keeper hadn't died. The keeper hadn't stopped. The keeper was still out there. The ground shuddered as the excavation team broke into the deepest chamber yet, a pocket of darkness sealed so tightly it felt like stepping into a tomb that had never intended to be opened. The air was colder here, dense, ancient, suffocating. Even the most seasoned investigators hesitated at the threshold. Their flashlights revealed a space far larger than any previous room. The walls were carved with unnatural precision, smoothed by hands that had worked tirelessly in silence. Bones, hundreds of them, lined the perimeter. Not scattered, not dumped, but arranged carefully, deliberately, almost reverently. Every skull faced inward, toward the center of the chamber. And at the center lay a circular pit. Its edges were reinforced with stone. Its depth unknown. But the soil around it was fresh. Too fresh. Dr. Ellison knelt beside it, brushing her gloved fingers over the surface. This was dug recently, she whispered. Maybe, months ago. Torres' heart pounded. But the house has been empty for years. A soft tremor rippled through the soil. Someone had been here. Someone had continued the work. Caldwell stared into the pit, dread clawing at his chest. There's someone still using these tunnels, he said quietly. And they're not finished.